I guess this is 2023. Time to see what kind of crap this year has in store for us. I sure hope this year has a little more positivity in it than last year, or at least the tail end of last year anyway. Last year, I guess, the old riding videos came to an end somewhere in early to mid-November. The bikes got tucked away for winter storage shortly after that. And then on the morning of November 30th, basically the whole world got flipped on its head. I had just finished working an evening shift, so I was still laying in bed. Tracy was up getting ready for work and getting our little girl ready for daycare. And then all of a sudden, the room just started spinning. She got terribly dizzy, to the point where she could barely walk or get around the house, and she managed to make it into the bedroom and tell me that something was wrong and I needed to get up. So I jumped out of bed. I automatically thought something was wrong with our little girl, so I ran out there to check on her, and she was fine. She was just watching cartoons and having breakfast. Tracy managed to get herself into the bathroom, and she was vomiting. She was incredibly dizzy. She couldn't get around. After vomiting for a while, she got into our bed and laid down. Her mother came and brought our little girl to daycare for us, and as soon as she walked out, Tracy said, "This is not right, you got to call an ambulance." So we called an ambulance, and they came and checked her out, and everything was checking out fine. Everything was, you know, normal, but obviously something was wrong. So they brought her into the emergency room and spent our day getting more and more tests done, trying to track down what the heck was going on. And they were narrowing things down more and more. Finally, they settled on an inner ear problem. They thought that there was some sort of buildup in her inner ear and it was causing the dizziness. But of course, they still wanted to go ahead with an MRI, even though the CT scans weren't really seeing anything. They wanted to go ahead with an MRI just to cover their bases and make sure everything was, you know, all right. So basically, they're explaining to me about this inner ear problem while she's been away having this MRI done for a while. And so after the explanation of the inner ear issue, you know, I was feeling better. It wasn't a terribly serious situation. It could be dealt with. And then it wasn't 5 minutes later, the doctor come rushing back over and said, "No, sorry, I'm wrong. This is a change of plans." It turns out she suffered a stroke, and a pretty significant one at that. The type of stroke that she suffered was not your typical stroke. It doesn't present itself like normal strokes do. Like, normally everyone is taught to look for certain things. I think the acronym they use is FAST: face, arm, speech, and time, I think. But none of that applied. For the most part, none of that was affected, at least not initially. Eventually her speech did get tougher, but not because it was difficult to speak, but more because she just had like an immense headache, and she was so incredibly dizzy that she just had to sit there with her eyes closed, and doing anything like that was just too much. So the type of stroke she suffered was actually called a cerebellar stroke, and it's pretty much totally localized within your cerebellum, which handles important things like balance and such. So for the first few days, it was rough, really scary. I think it was probably a solid 36 hours before she could even open her eyes. Once she was moved into the neurological ICU, she wasn't allowed to do anything. They did not want her straining herself one bit. She wasn't allowed to get out of bed or anything. Not that she really wanted to, the condition that she was in. I think these types of stroke affect something like less than 5% of stroke victims. It can be a pretty difficult road to recovery, but I gotta say she's doing amazing. Her last few days in the hospital were basically spent learning to walk again. And then she came home and continued on with that and seeing physiotherapists, and now here we are. You know, this is May 7th, I think. To see her today out in public, you probably wouldn't even realize that anything happened. She certainly knows something happened, and she feels the effects of it, but she's learning to cope with it and learning to live with it, I guess. She'll always have some level of dizziness basically for the rest of her life. I guess she's just learning to get used to her new normal like that. So all of this going on while we're learning to raise a 2 and now 3-year-old, it's not exactly easy. Tracy's been off work recovering ever since. The plan as of right now is for her to start integrating back into work around the 1st of July. Almost immediately after it happened, she looked at me and she said, I don't know if I'll ever be able to ride a motorcycle again. And, you know, it hadn't really dawned on me at that time because that was the furthest thing from my mind. I mean, and I'm sure it bothers her more than anything else, but I mean, after what I witnessed and what we went through back in November and December, it was like, if that's the price we have to pay, so be it. That is far from the end of the world as far as I'm concerned. So I guess for now the plan for Tracy's Ninja hasn't really changed too much. She didn't have a lot of time to ride it in the last couple of years anyway. But now she's not really sure what the future holds for her with it. You know, myself as an observer, just seeing how she's progressed, I can totally see her riding a bike again. You know, in time, I think she'll be feeling ready for it eventually. And I mean, who knows, maybe it won't be that bike that makes her feel comfortable. Maybe it would have to be something else. Maybe we'll have to find another one for her. That's certainly not the end of the world either. Either way, her bike doesn't owe us anything. It's not exactly a burden to hang on to it. We'll just keep it moving throughout the season, get it out once in a while, just to exercise it a bit. As long as we don't let it sit stagnant for too long, it won't be too bad. Besides that, I'm sure there's other things that have happened throughout the winter to mention, but everything else kind of pales in comparison, so I can't even think of much else. Oh, I guess our stable's got more Hondas creeping in. It started with the Nighthawk, and then I found that BFR to come stay for a little while and make a couple bucks with. And then our little girl's little 50, we bought her a little CRF 50. And now this winter, a Honda snowblower got added too. You know, it might not be a bike, but every little bit counts. They're creeping their way in. I gotta be careful. I think the only other sickness that entered my brain last year and hasn't really gone away is the thought of owning another Suzuki. That 1000 GT is still on my mind. Actually, when I went to buy that snowblower, I picked it up at a dealership in Dartmouth. While they were getting it ready, I wandered over to the Suzuki end of the dealership. They had one on the floor. First time I got to see one in person. They're a very odd looking bike. From some angles they're beautiful, and from other angles they're just the goofiest thing you've ever seen. But I mean, to be fair, I'm kind of that way too, but you know, without all that beautiful stuff. But yeah, with all that being said, I don't have real high hopes for getting a lot of miles in this year. I mean, I feel kind of guilty taking off for the day on a bike, leaving Tracy alone, looking after the little one. You know, I felt that way anyway. And then now I really don't feel like doing that to her, right? Even though it's her telling me, go, get on your bike, go for a ride. Just doesn't seem right at times, I guess. So one thing I did think about was, if I'm not going to get out for as many full day, you know, leave the province rides on this thing, well, maybe I can increase the amount of short riding closer to home. And to do that, I kind of prefer to use the Nighthawk for it. But as it sits, the Nighthawk is not very enjoyable to ride. I'm not 100% used to the riding position of it, but even that's not the problem. The suspension is the problem. So what do you do with a 40-plus-year-old bike that is very poorly suspended, especially in the front end? Especially a bike like this that is just an absolute heap, right? The bike is not in great shape these days. You probably don't want to spend too much money on it, right? So the natural move, of course, is to contact Racetech, right? Yeah, of course. That's what you do. I shot off an email to their vintage specialist, Matt, just kind of talking about the Nighthawk suspension, and you know, I told him it seems like it makes no sense. It's incredibly harsh over small bumps, but if you look at it too hard, it'll bottom out. So I thought I was crazy, but he verified that yes, that is basically what those types of forks do. I think the term for them was air-assisted damper rod forks or something like that. I think these days they'd just be called crap. So I basically got him to put together a parts list of what he would do with it. And right away I had to trust him because he remembers the days when that Nighthawk was brand new on a dealer floor. Possibly a dealer he was working at. He was probably selling the damn things. And he's very familiar with Racetech. He's been a customer for decades, and then he used to sell it, and now he works for them. The two things I wanted him to do was to recommend springs and spring rates and a set of emulators, and then recommend which would he install first, because you don't want to throw all that money at this bike right away. Maybe do one then the other kind of thing, right? So he said first things first, you have to replace the springs. The springs are way too weak, way too undersprung, which is what I assumed. The bike is so damn heavy that I just didn't feel like those forks were strong enough to deal with it, and they weren't right from day one. So I started sourcing parts, and I quickly found out that nowhere around here has anything. Check Fort 9, check local dealers who dealt with, you know, Parts Canada and things like that, and nobody could find stock. They were telling me these things were discontinued, and while talking to Racetech, while talking to Matt, he didn't say anything about parts being discontinued. So I managed to get in touch with Bayside Performance. They're out of British Columbia. That's who my buddy Jake dealt with to get suspension parts for his ST. And they were able to get in touch with Racetech directly, order the parts I wanted, get them shipped to them, and then basically ship them out to me. Naturally, I'm sure they, you know, added a bit of a markup to everything because they've got to make their cut on this, but it was just easier that way, less headache. And I just checked this morning and all those parts showed up in town, I think at 6 a.m. this morning. So they should be out on a truck tomorrow to be delivered to me. So that means I got to find some free time to tear that Nighthawk apart again. Those progressive springs that I put in there are getting taken out. Matt suggested that I send them back to China where they came from. I guess the ultimate goal, like I told Matt, I have this thing for when I want to go fast, when I want to have fun. You know, I just want the Nighthawk to be able to cruise comfortably. So it's getting stiffer springs to address bottoming out and stuff like that. But then the emulators should take care of the compression dampening to smooth out the ride and not make it so damn harsh over little bumps. It sucks that I got to permanently modify the forks to do this. I have to disable the anti-dive, but that's not a big deal because it doesn't do shit anyway. But I basically have to drill out the damper rods to increase oil flow. So basically the emulator valve is going to control all of that compression damping. It's going to turn all of that over to the valve. But I also have that other set of forks out of the other old Nighthawk, so if for whatever crazy reason I don't like this, then it can be reversed. I just have to swap out the the inner pieces of the fork. But I really don't anticipate having to do that. So yeah, make the Nighthawk a more comfortable bike to ride. That's the plan. So you're riding over roads like this. It's very rough on a sport bike. You know, the 10 suspension is pretty stiff. It doesn't really care for this kind of stuff. Well, it doesn't care. It doesn't care one bit about this stuff, but it sends all of it up to me, and it sucks. You know, I wanted to get the 10 out for the first ride this year, but realistically, a little cruise like this would have been much better suited on the Nighthawk. But taking the Nighthawk on a road like this would be just hell. It would just beat itself to death and beat me to death. You know, I've had some significant bumps jump out of nowhere and hit them on this bike, and I can honestly say I've never bottomed it out. But I mean, I don't think I've ever bottomed out any sport bike I've ever owned. I've probably never bottomed out any other bike I've ever owned besides that damn Nighthawk. I think that's a characteristic of old school suspension that, you know, manufacturers quickly realized this is not safe. You know, we've got to improve this to the point where at least that won't happen. At least not under normal situations. Anyway, I guess that's enough yapping. Enjoy a little more of this ride and head for home. Nap time's just about coming to an end, I'm sure. It's funny because I've lived where we are now for, you know, approaching 4 years, and I still forget, get out for rides on the bike like this, and totally forget that we live where we do now. So getting home from a ride like this takes a little bit longer than it used to. For many years I come back from rides from the usual direction I head in, and you know, I was immediately home. I wouldn't have to cross town or go way the heck out of the way. It's not like that anymore. But then again, the last 3 or 4 years have just been a blur. They passed by in what feels like the same amount of time 1 year would have taken. Woo! A big Canadian flag in the distance and a strong smell of cow shit off the fields. There's a nice ending. So I guess we'll call it here as I make my way back home. First one of the year on the ZX-10 in the bag. We'll just have to wait and see how many more there actually are this year.